Hello and welcome to Rising. I'm Amber Athey, and I'm thrilled to be back this Friday co-hosting with Jessica Burbank.
We're back in action. I bet they thought they'd seen The Last of Us.
Never. We've got a lot of news to get into today, so let's go ahead and get started. G7 nations unveiled a substantial sanctions package against Russia today at the group's summit in Hiroshima, Japan. This new package will include blacklisting 300 individuals, entities, vessels, and aircraft across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, as well as expanded authority to target sectors of the Russian economy, quote, key to its military-industrial complex, a senior administration official said, and to impose new bans to prevent Russia from benefiting from our services. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is set to make an in-person visit to the summit on Sunday. G7 leaders reiterated their support for Ukraine after a closed-door meeting, stating, quote, "We, the leaders of the G7, reaffirmed our commitment to stand together against Russia's illegal, unjustifiable, and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine." This comes just as the Department of Defense revealed it has significantly reduced its estimate of the value of weapons it has sent to Ukraine, freeing up at least $3 billion to help fund the war. Joining us now to weigh in is White House reporter at The Hill, Brett Samuels. Brett, thank you so much for joining us this morning. On these sanctions, what makes these different from past sanctions packages, and what effect are these G7 leaders hoping that these will have on the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, guys. Obviously sort of a significant moment to be rolling out these sanctions at the G7 with all these leaders in one place in Japan. It sort of builds on the sanctions we've already seen over the past year plus, where the US and allies are, targeting the Russian economy, targeting these different sectors, whether it be, minerals or gas and oil, these sort of different sectors that sort of help fund the Russian war effort in Ukraine. So this is just sort of building on that, obviously adding various entities and people to that. But certainly I think it's significant that they're doing this at the G7 with all these leaders together. As you mentioned, President Zelensky set to join them. Sort of this show of unity, this show of force that even more than a year later, this group of countries is still kind of trying to show that they're still united in this effort, still going to keep putting pressure on Russia where they can.
When it comes to sanctioning Russia, it's been the case in the past. I think of foreign correspondent Stephen Kinzer going to Russia and speaking with a waiter, and they were talking about all of the great cheese that they have that is now Russian-made cheese, which Russia didn't always make cheese. They would import it from Europe, but because of the sanctions, Russia became quite good at cheese making. So it's kind of this example of how sometimes sanctions can make Russia a little bit more self-reliant and force them to grow their economy in ways that they wouldn't otherwise. Do you think that that could be a potential unintended consequence of these sanctions?
Yeah, it definitely could be. The Biden administration and other folks talked about sort of early on in this effort, this idea of unintended consequences with sanctions. This idea that maybe sort of the flip side of that you may be inadvertently punishing, Russian workers and folks who did not necessarily support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but that these sanctions target their sort of economic sector that they work in. So, there's that side of it. There's the flip side that you mentioned, this idea that Russia sort of adapts over time so that these sanctions aren't quite as effective or aren't as powerful because Russia is figuring out ways to be self-reliant or to work around, its relationships with Europe or other nations. So certainly there are this potential for unintended consequences, but at this point, the Biden administration and their allies have been sort of steadfast and adamant that sanctions are the best way to sort of squeeze Russia's economy and ultimately grind down sort of the war effort and the funding for that.
Brett, I'm hoping you can give us some more details on this accounting error that somehow freed up $3 billion. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it does seem a little bit convenient. It's no secret that Ukraine has a history of corruption. So do we have a better sense of where exactly this money was found in the books?
Yeah, so Biden officials have basically said, that this was just an accounting error that was discovered, several weeks ago, actually, but now it's just coming to light now. And there's sort of a couple different ways that you could look at it and a couple different ways that I think this will play out in the coming days as we learn more about it and as folks, pay more attention to it, which is on the one hand, there's this argument that We have $3 billion more than we thought we did to help fund the Ukrainian war effort. So that should put folks at ease who are worried about the amount of money that we're spending on aiding Ukraine. But the flip side of that is there's already, I think, a lot of skepticism, certainly in the House with Republicans, about how much money is being spent to help Ukraine, about whether all that money is being properly accounted for. And I think this idea that, here's $3 billion that was found just through some poor accounting or through a bookkeeping error, that's just going to fuel some of the skepticism and some of the suspicion, I think, among lawmakers and others who wonder whether the U.S. is spending too much money or needs to be spending more money to help Ukraine in this war effort.
Yeah, it sounds like they did some kind of calculation, right? If we were to buy X, Y, and Z weapons and equipment, and we paid the price as if it were brand new equipment, then it would be, valued at X. But instead, now they're saying, well, let's look at what the sale price would be, and that's a difference of $3 billion. I don't know, to me, when I think about the Pentagon not passing audits in many years, it's not believable to me. But do you think it's right at all to be speculating about this?
Yeah, at this point, it seems like the Pentagon is chalking this up to sort of a bookkeeping error, to an accounting error. Like you said, they sort of overestimated the cost of the weapons that they were sending. So that's what we've heard from the Pentagon so far. Certainly, I would expect, with the House Republicans being in a majority there, that we'll have some lawmakers looking to dig into this a bit more. Certainly, given already sort of the skepticism that some of them have about how much money is being spent to aid Ukraine with military equipment.
Is there any indication that these G7 leaders are going to be talking about Russia in regards to energy? Because Germany, of course, had issues last year with becoming reliant on Russian gas and oil for a period of time due to its sort of all-in approach to green energy policy. What is the energy discussion looking like in these preliminary talks?
Yeah, so, obviously the Biden administration has pushed this idea that climate change and energy consumption is going to be a big topic for G7 leaders. In a broad sense, this idea of being less reliant on, these different sources of energy. And I think one of the big issues at the center of that is like you mentioned, Amber, this idea that Germany especially, but other European countries have been very reliant on Russia for its energy, through pipelines. So certainly I think it will come up in those conversations, but I think the Biden administration certainly wants to promote this idea of, transitioning to more renewable sources of energy, to more climate friendly sources of energy. So, but certainly it's hard to talk about that without addressing sort of the elephant in the room, this idea of reliance on Russian energy for certain European countries.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Are you expecting the other G7 countries to join in on the sanctions? Because it seems that these are mostly, at the hands of the United States. And it seems that announcing them at this conference is intended to put pressure on the other G7 countries to join in. Is that your read on the situation?
Right. So what we've seen so far is the United States announcing these sanctions. And we have seen from the G7 leaders this sort of joint statement in which they laid out support for Ukraine, in which they vowed to continue pressuring Russia to end its war in Ukraine. So I would expect that we'll see some action, certainly from G7 leaders, because they want to promote this united front. They don't want to suggest that there are cracks in this alliance. But we are still waiting to see, I think, the specifics of whether these other countries will go as far as the U.S., whether they will match all of these sanctions, or how specifically they'll play out. But certainly that bears watching, just to see, because I think Russia is certainly looking for kind of any cracks or any signs of weakening in this alliance.
Thank you so much, Brett Samuels, White House reporter with The Hill. We appreciate you talking about this with us. More Rising after this.